shaft alignment. We're talking spining, we're talking flowing, we're talking puring, and we're talking should you do it. Let's go. Hi everyone, welcome to the Mobile Club Maker. I'm AJ. I hope you're having a wonderful day today. So, spine alignment. This has been a topic that I've had on my schedule for a while now. I've had a lot of people asking questions about different elements of this, and I've just sort of basically said, just hang on, I've got a video coming. I'm just trying to get it sort of figure out the navigation of it, how I want to get from point A to point B in this video. So I think at this point I've got it at least a pretty good idea of what I want to show you to sort of make my points as clear as I can. And that's what we're going to look at today. So we're going to cover a few different things in this video. First, we're going to talk about, well, what is shaft alignment? When you hear that phrase, what are we talking about? Secondly, we're going to talk about, okay, well, how do we figure out where this spine is or where this bend plane is, this ideal sort of setup when you install the club, this ideal orientation for the shaft? How do you find that out? So we're going to cover spining, we're going to cover flowing, and we're going to talk about puring or SST puring. Last thing we're going to talk about, and probably the thing you're wondering about the most, is, well, knowing all that, what do I think about it? What do I think about either spending the time or spending the money to have someone else shaft align your golf clubs? Is it worth it? Is it something you should consider, or is it something that you should stay away from? Okay, so first off, well, what is shaft alignment? Very simply, shaft alignment is an idea that, with the understanding that golf shafts are not perfectly symmetrical in how they flex. Depending on how you turn this shaft and apply a load to it, in a certain orientation, it's going to be stiffer than a slightly different orientation. So this shaft with the logo up, when I bend it, has a certain stiffness to it. But when I rotate it, say 90 degrees, bend it again, the stiffness may be slightly different. Now, ideally, a golf shaft would be perfectly consistent all the way around it. It would have the same stiffness all the way around. But unfortunately, that rarely happens. That's very difficult to do. So the idea of shaft alignment says, well, understanding that these shafts are not perfect, we believe that there is a certain position that you can install the shaft into the club in that will provide better results, that makes that shaft better because it is in this certain orientation. Okay, so when you hear the word shaft alignment, what goes along with that is going to be spine and natural bending position. Very simply, the spine is just the stiffest axis of the shaft. So the stiffest plane, when you build a shaft, either steel or graphite, if the layers are a little bit thicker on one side, it's going to make the shaft stiffer, and that is considered the spine. The spine is the stiffest portion, the stiffest bending plane of the shaft. The natural bending position is at 90 degrees from there, basically, and that is going to be the softest or the weakest plane. How do you go about finding the spine of a golf club, or how do you go about finding the natural bending position of a golf club? Well, there's a few different ways to do it. The oldest method is referred to as spining. Okay, now very quickly on spining, because it has been proven basically to be incredibly unreliable and basically useless. But all you're doing is essentially loading the shaft with some ball bearings on either side and rotating it in an attempt to find the spine of the shaft. The problem with this method is all shafts will have some residual bend to them. The shaft is not perfectly straight. Pretty much none of them are. They all have a very slight bend to them, some of them more than others. And what ends up happening when you try and spine a golf club is the spining process isn't usually finding the spine so much as it's finding the bend. And so all you're doing is finding the bend in that shaft, which may coincidentally be where the spine is, but in many cases it's not. So spining is a process that was used years ago. There's probably some club makers who are still using it. You can still buy spining equipment, but it is largely considered sort of pointless at this point because it's so unreliable. Okay, so the next method, flowing. What is flowing? Flowing, FLO, that stands for flat line oscillation. And you will see a lot of videos on YouTube about flowing. I think flowing is really popular because it's so simple to do and doesn't require a lot of tools, and you can see the results very definitively. Basically what you're doing in FLOing, and I will show you very quickly here, you lock one side of the shaft into a vise, you put a weight on the other side. You'll often see people use a weight with some sort of laser on the end of it so you can get a better idea of what the shaft is doing. But really any sort of weight or even the club head itself can be used. And you're going to bend, you're going to put tension on the shaft and release it and just watch what happens to it. And what you're trying to do is find the plane, find the orientation of the shaft where the shaft moves completely straight in an up and down line. In the beginning, the first couple of positions we had gave results where you eventually get to this sort of circle pattern going. And we moved it a few different times till we eventually found a spot that gave us, when we flicked it, a perfectly straight up and down line, or close to a perfectly straight up and down line. That would be considered one of the flow planes. Now again, there should be usually two flow planes. There should be a hard side flow plane on the spine, and there should be a soft side on that natural bending position. So you should find two different spines basically 90 degrees apart. Again, once you find these spines, this is how you would then orient the shaft when you install it into the golf club. Okay, so what is puring? Well, puring is essentially, it's an automated process where it finds the spine of the shaft first, and then it finds the flow planes and does all these things. Like I said, it's an automated process. You don't have to do much other than move a couple jigs back and forth, but it finds all that, tells you where the supposed most stable position of that shaft is, and once it does that, it marks it, or you mark it, with a little line. And that is how you would install the shaft, with that line pointing up in the 12 o'clock position, essentially. That is what puring is doing. It's basically finding the spine and finding the flow lines, putting them together in an automated process. Okay, so we've gone over all the processes. We've talked about why spining isn't really useful. It isn't a reliable method. But now we need to really sort of focus in on, well, what is this flowing thing actually doing, and does it make sense that that's what we should be paying attention to? Because both the flowing process and the puring process both utilize this idea of flowing, this flat line oscillation, to supposedly get you the shaft in the ideal orientation to make it more consistent. And it's not surprising, because you look at somebody do one of these shaft flowings and it starts doing all sorts of crazy circles and ellipses, and you're thinking to yourself, how the heck did I ever hit that golf shaft? Because look at it, it's going crazy over there. Or you look at some of the charts that the puring analysis prints out. Oh, before you had all this, all of this oscillation moving up and down and around, and it was a mess, and now look at it afterward, it's a perfectly straight line. That all sounds great, that sounds wonderful. That makes you think, wow, that shaft was really out of whack, and now it's perfectly in line. Here's the thing though, when you go through either of these processes, what are they measuring? What are they actually looking at? They're looking at the shaft oscillating over a period of time. Okay? So they're looking at the shaft going back and forth over 5 seconds, over 10 seconds, something like that. But the shaft is oscillating back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Guess what? That's not how a golf shaft works in a golf swing. A golf shaft doesn't oscillate back and forth in a golf swing. It oscillates once. You flex it, you load that shaft once, and then it releases in the golf swing. That's it. There's no second load and release. There's definitely no third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 10th, 20th, however far out you want to go. There's only one. So people have this idea. They look at the puring chart and they see how big the dispersion is on that first graph, and then the second one is basically a straight line. Or you look at this flowing method and you can do it yourself, and it seems like such a giant difference between something that does these crazy circles and ellipses and something that gives you just a perfectly straight line. But the question is really, that's not how the golf shaft works. Why are we looking at all these additional oscillations? We should just be looking at one oscillation, one time flexing and releasing the shaft, because that's all that's happening in the golf swing. Anything more than that has no relevance in golf. That's not what the golf shaft does. So I'm going to show you now a little demonstration to sort of hopefully give you a better idea of what you should really be concerned about and why I don't think that flowing and puring is really in any way useful, primarily because of this idea that this flatline oscillation is what they're utilizing. So what I'm going to show you now is the setup that I put together to basically capture just the initial oscillation, the one oscillation in each plane for a shaft. So what we have here is essentially just the shaft in a vise with, I've got my frequency meter here too, which I'll bring back later, but you'll notice I also have a 360-degree protractor. I've got my laser pointer on the end, and I've also built sort of a quick release jig that I could use. The reason for that is when you see people flowing shafts, they just kind of do it, and when you saw me do it earlier, I was just using my hand and they just kind of do it willy-nilly. So you're not getting a consistent release point. What this is going to do is give a very consistent release point every single time. Now, full disclosure, I did this, I've run all these shafts, and after doing it and watching all the high-speed footage, there is a very slight initial move to the left on every one of these shafts as a result of the mechanism that I'm using on this quick release. You know, ideally, it would have been perfect if it just went and released it perfectly straight. But every one of them releases just slightly to the left, and so they all come back a little. And while that is not ideal, it in no way changes the results, because my goal in doing this, in having this jig, was to eliminate a variable, the variable of possibly when you release that shaft, maybe pulling it a little one way or the other, or not releasing it consistently. This releases the shaft the exact same every single time. So even though it has that very slight move to the left, every single time it has that same move to the left. So we can still watch it, we can still see the results, and that is not a variable, that is a constant. So I think all the results I'm going to show you are every bit as accurate, even though it has that very slight curve to it. I've got 4 different shafts I used. One OEM made for shaft that was in a major manufacturer's driver last year, one steel shaft that was pured, and 2 graphite driver shafts that were also pured. We're going to put all those in. The pured shafts, I went ahead and used the recommended puring position as my 0 degree. At that point, I took 6 different measurements. We did 6 different oscillation checks, let's call them, on each shaft. So we took one at that 0 position. In the case of the pured shafts, that was the pured position. Then we moved the shaft 30 degrees, did another one, moved it 30 degrees, kept moving 30 degrees. So we went from 0 to 180. Okay, so I don't know what your thoughts on this were, but when I watched this and when I went back and looked at each of these different shafts in each of these different orientations, what I basically came to the conclusion of was they all look about the same. There's really no difference. There was no outlier. There was no oh, the shaft that was pured in this position did this, and then when it wasn't pured, it was way out here. They all looked basically identical. Every single one of them, be it the steel, be it the graphite, be it the pured, be it the non-pured, be it in the pured position or in the non-pured position, they all had the exact same look, give or take maybe a millimeter. You know, the laser obviously is only so fine. I can only get so detailed on there, but I would say, and you can agree or disagree, but I would say that they basically all had the exact same movement. So this idea that you need to, you know, pure your shaft or you need to flow your shaft to get a more consistent result in how the shaft flexes, well, this shows very clearly that the shaft is flexing consistently regardless of what position you put it in. When it bends down and it releases, it basically went to that same position every single time, regardless of where the so-called, you know, pured position, regardless of where the spine position was. It just goes back to it. If you left that shaft on there to keep oscillating long enough, yes, it would eventually start doing other things and making circles and making different shapes. But for one cycle, which is representative of the golf shaft, they were the same. Okay, last thing I'm going to say on this is, because I've seen this also often in discussion of puring or in discussion of flowing, where someone will say, well, it takes the, it removes the inconsistencies from the shaft. It's when you align the shaft in a certain orientation, it removes inconsistencies. And what I will tell you is, you're not removing inconsistencies. You are simply moving inconsistencies. It's basically, think about it like if you have a car with 3 good tires and the driver's side front tire is completely flat. Now, would you ever consider just moving that tire to, say, the passenger side front tire and not doing anything else to it, and then considering that you have somehow improved the performance of that car? Well, probably not, because you haven't actually changed anything other than you've moved it around. The issue is still there. The problem, the flat tire, is still there. It's the same thing with golf shafts. If you have a golf shaft that is so bad, is so out of round, is so out of flex, where the hard side is so much stiffer than the soft side, if you have that shaft, then simply rotating it into any orientation, it doesn't matter what orientation it is, that doesn't change anything. That shaft is still a bad shaft. That shaft should have never made it out of the factory. It should have been scrapped at the factory. So the idea that, you know, you can take a shaft that's not great and somehow make it a great shaft because you're removing the irregularities, you're not removing anything. That is an impossibility. You cannot remove the irregularities of a shaft. Whatever is in that shaft is in that shaft. It doesn't matter which way you turn it. Okay, so hopefully we've answered the question when it comes to shaft alignment. Do I think that it makes sense to align your shafts either using spining, flowing, or puring? And I think the answer is no. I think we've shown that all these methods are built on, you know, sort of faulty ideas and a shaky foundation that is not representative of what a shaft does in the golf swing. And when you sort of look at the shafts as they act in the golf swing, you can see that they're all very consistent, and it's not worth the effort. So go ahead, get that shaft, install it however you want, logo up, logo down, logo sideways, and don't worry about it. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Also, go down below, and if you have not, think about subscribing to the channel. Also, hit that little bell icon so you can be notified when I release new videos. If you have a question or a comment, please leave that down below. I try and answer all the questions and read all the comments. I'm also on Instagram now. You can find me at Mobile Club Maker. Until next time, take care. We will see you on the next video. Bye.